Alright, so today I want to show you how to make a high white albino ball python. Essentially what an albino is, it's a yellow and white snake with about 50-50 yellow and white. And there's actually other genes you can add to the albino to increase the amount of white and decrease the amount of yellow. It's a pretty interesting effect. As a matter of fact, there's actually multiple genes that have this effect, and you can stack them on top of each other to increase the effect even further. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you how to make a high white albino ball python. Alright, so I want to jump over here at Morphmarket.com and I want to start with an albino by itself without any other genes in the mix. And this is what an albino looks like. Really visually stunning snake just by itself. It's actually a recessive gene, so you actually need 2 copies of the albino for visual. And kind of the interesting thing is if you actually shop for some albinos, you'll actually see some listed as a high contrast or a low contrast albino. And essentially what that means is if you actually take a look at the kind of the division between the yellows and the whites, you'll actually see in a high contrast it has a really sharp line, and in a low contrast it looks like someone almost took a paintbrush and kind of smoothed out the edges, kind of like over here on this side you see right here, it's kind of smoothed out, not quite as sharp of a line, but overall I'd say this is a really high contrast albino. And kind of the weird thing is when you work these other genes in to increase the amount of white in the albino, a lot of times it also increases the contrast, which is a pretty interesting effect. So the first thing that comes to mind when I think of adding one gene to increase the amount of white, that is the black pastel. I've known this is pretty much the first one I knew about. The black pastel albino has an interesting effect. And the black pastel is actually a dark gene, and it's kind of interesting. A lot of these are actually dark genes. Normally when you mix a dark gene with a lot of other combos, it darkens the background, but with the albino, you pretty much mix anything with the albino and you end up with an albino that has kind of a jumbled up pattern. It almost doesn't let anything break through. And when you work in some of these dark genes, pretty much the effect that you get is you actually get a reduction of the yellow and an increase of the white, which is kind of weird. And the black pastel is actually allelic with cinnamon, looks really close to cinnamon. And if you breed them together, you get the 8-ball, and it acts like a super, which is interesting. You can actually tell the difference between a black pastel and a cinnamon. Usually the black pastel is darker in the background, and it usually has a little bit more gold color as far as the color of the snake. So here's what happens if you work black pastel into the albino. Take a look at this. This is, I'd say hands down, this is probably one of my favorite albino combinations working in black pastel. It's kind of interesting how it really increases the amount of white and reduces the amount of yellow. It kind of shrinks it down into these little tiny patterns on the side and little dots on the top. And you can definitely tell in this one it really increases the contrast overall. It makes for a really stunning visual effect. So take a look at this. Here's another dark morph. This is the blackhead. And when it comes to dark genes, I'd say the blackhead is the darkest of the dark. You pretty much mix blackhead with anything else, and it has a really visually dominant effect where it really darkens the background of the combinations, unless you mix it with albino and it doesn't darken it, which is kind of weird. So here's what happens if you take the blackhead and you work it into the albino. Take a look at this. This is pretty amazing. And this one's actually a blackhead lavender. So this is the lavender albino version of the albino. So there's the regular albino, the lavender albino, and it seems like it works pretty much the same across all versions of albino. You also have the toffees, the toffinos, the candies, and the candinos, and it pretty much works the same with those. But you have to keep in mind the lavenders and the toffees, a lot of times you'll have really bright white background that really kind of turns into a lavender color or kind of a completely different color as it ages and matures, versus the true albino, which really keeps a bright white background. That is a really stunning animal. So take a look at this one. This is kind of interesting. You can actually stack the 2 genes on top of each other. And look at this crazy thing. This one is so amazing. This is actually the blackhead black pastel. So you have 2 dark genes. Both of them reduce the amount of yellow, increase the amount of white, and you actually add them together and you get almost a completely white snake. Almost, you really reduce the yellows down to nothing. It's kind of interesting. Some of these albinos are a little bit more orange. You notice on this one, it's kind of orange, and some of them are bright yellow. I think it really depends on the version of the albino. So here's another gene that actually reduces it as well. This is the cinnamon. Pretty much acts the same as black pastel. This is actually allelic with black pastel. You breed them together and you get an 8-ball, which is a completely black patternless snake. Pretty much acts the same as the super cinnamon or the super black pastel. And at first I thought the cinnamon and the black pastel were pretty much the same thing, and I actually did a comparison video, and I'm pretty convinced that the cinnamon and black pastel are two completely separate genes, and they're probably the two most variable genes. You can line up like a dozen cinnamons and you'll see a whole bunch of different shades of, you know, really dark ones and then kind of like a brownish red one like this. And it's the same way with the black pastel. Pretty interesting. So here's what happens if you take cinnamon and you work it into the albino. Take a look at this. Pretty much acts almost exactly the same way as when you're working black pastel into the snake. Really high contrast, and it really brings out a lot of the white. Really impressive combination. So take a look at this one. This is kind of interesting. This is actually called the cue ball. So this is kind of a play on words. Essentially what this is, if you actually look at the genes on this, this has one copy of the black pastel, one copy of the cinnamon. So both of them increase the amount of white on the albino. But if you actually breed the cinnamon to the black pastel, you get the all black snake, completely patternless. And then when you work in the albino, you get this interesting effect where you actually get kind of a little tiny speckles of albino, mostly white, and you can definitely see the kind of the red eyes in this. Pretty interesting combination. So here is the Mojave. The Mojave is another gene that really has an interesting effect on the albino. The Mojave is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you actually breed a Mojave to anything else in the blue-eyed leucistic, sometimes you get a white snake and sometimes you get the purplish colored snakes like the purple passions or the mystic potions. Here's what happens if you work the Mojave into the albino. This is kind of an interesting effect. Take a look at this. Essentially what you get is you get kind of this I've seen a lot of these, almost like an iridescent sheen on these, and it kind of fades it out. It almost brings it into a lower contrast, which is a pretty interesting effect. So take a look at this. You can actually take it one step further and take the Mojave and work it into the black pastel, stacking them on top of each other, and take a look at what kind of effect that has. The black pastel almost reverses it and increases the contrast, and then the Mojave really reduces the yellow pattern down to almost nothing. You get almost a really white snake. This is a really amazing combination. As a matter of fact, I was wondering how much these are. I haven't really looked at the prices. This one actually sold for $450. Pretty amazing. So take a look at this. This is actually called the cherry bomb. If you want to go all white and reduce all the yellow color down to pretty much zero, essentially what this is a super Mojave albino. And when it comes to albinos, usually when you work other genes into the albino, you can get a really visually dominant effect from the albino. But if you have a super Mojave, a true blue-eyed leucistic, which is an all-white snake, even that will trump the albino, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of weird when you mix certain genes together and you get certain genes pairing up and having a visual dominance effect where it completely masks all the other genes, which is, so essentially what this is a blue-eyed leucistic with, instead of blue eyes, you get the red eyes from the albino, also known as the cherry bomb. And you can pretty much do the same thing if you actually have like a Mojave lesser or a super lesser or a lesser bamboo or any of the genes, most of the genes in the blue-eyed leucistic. I don't think you could really do it with like a Mojave mystic for the mystic potion, because you'd actually see some of the pattern breaking through. So here is the chocolate, another dark gene. Pretty amazing that this also has an influence as far as increasing the amount of white in the albino. And the chocolate's kind of interesting. You can make some really amazing dark combos, and I think a lot of people overlook the chocolate. It's pretty amazing. I actually did a video on the chocolate. It's a really interesting dark gene. And here's what happens if you work chocolate into, I actually stacked it on top of this. This is actually a black pastel chocolate. Look at what the chocolate does to the black pastel albino. Crazy effect. This one is really amazing. I really love the stripe right down the top of the snake. And once you start going down this road, you can add so many genes and stacking them into your albinos to make some really impressive combinations. And this one's really interesting. It actually has, it almost looks like it has some high contrast areas and then some low contrast areas. I actually have one albino. It's kind of the same way. It's weird. It has all of these. It's like a really high contrast, and it almost like it looks like someone painted on top of it some low contrast colors. And I really like the difference between them. Makes a really interesting visual appearance. If you're wondering how much this one sold for, this one $450. Not too bad for a crazy looking snake like that. That's pretty awesome. So here's a few other things I wanted to add at the end, where you can kind of do it, you know, kind of the other way. You can actually add pine to your albino to add in, you know, some big splotches of white instead of using some of these other dark genes. So essentially what a pied is, it's another recessive gene, and when you add the pied to the albino, you get a pied looking snake, but all the different areas that are usually dark in the pied have this albino looking color, which is pretty interesting. And you can actually add other genes to the albino pied to increase the white even further. You can actually add the spider. So if you actually had a spider albino pied, the spider pushes all the color just to the head. Another one you can add is the russo. You may not know that you can add the russo to the pied, and what that does is it always gives you a really high white snake. If you want to add a lot of white to your albino, you can add the russo pied, which is kind of the slang for russo pied is the pinto pied. The russo gene is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, also known as the het leucistic, which is kind of interesting. And a lot of times with the pinto pies, sometimes you'll actually get an all-white snake, and sometimes you'll get just little splotches here and there. With the spider pied, you'll actually get only color just on the head, but if you actually add russo to the pied, it'll be just random little bits of color kind of all over the snake, which is pretty cool. And here's another one you can actually do if you're going for the all-white albino and reducing all the color. You can add in a xanthic. This is actually the VPI version of a xanthic. And a xanthic is another recessive. It usually strips all the color and you end up with a black and gray and silver snake, and then you add it to the albino, and for some reason it forms this completely white snake, which is known as the snow. The snow is the common name of the axanthic plus the albino, which is kind of interesting. So I actually have one more over here. Take a look at this. If you want to go completely in the opposite direction, this could be another video. You can actually increase the amount of yellow in your albino instead of increasing the amount of white. And pretty much the number one thing you can add is pinstripe. When you work pinstripe into your albinos, you get a really yellow, solid yellow snake. Look at the lines on this, really pretty amazing. You can definitely see the pinstripe under the albino. And this one's kind of interesting too. This is actually the albino black pastel pinstripe. So the black pastel increases the amount of white, the pinstripe increases the amount of yellow, and in this case the pinstripe definitely trumps the black pastel. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Joseph Wallace asks, can I send you a picture of my ball python because I bought it from the store and they had it listed as a fancy? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, if you bought it as a fancy, I'm pretty sure I know what store that you actually bought it from. It's weird that they don't list the genes on some of those ball pythons. And if you actually want to show me your snake, probably the best way to do it is to take a short video and upload it to your YouTube channel and show me the top, the sides, and the bottom of the snake, and maybe the eyes, a close-up of the eyes and all the patterns on the side. That way you can get a better view of the whole entire snake. And sometimes it's kind of tricky trying to figure out what genes are in a snake, especially if it's multiple genes. Sometimes it's kind of hard to pick them out, but sometimes it's really easy. If you actually upload a video over there and just leave a comment under any of my videos and say, hey, I uploaded this video, can you help me ID this snake? I'll try to get to it, I'll check out this snake, and we'll try to figure out what genes are in your snake. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.